And Evelyn, just to let everyone know, we are going to record this session, and Evelyn, Dr. Vasquez, is going to begin recording right now. So our keynote today is creating anti-racist and liberated collegiate recovery programs. We want to let you know that recordings of this webinar will be available on our WOVA platform. And then after, we will have it available on our Center for Healthy Communities on that platform, as well as our Healthy Campus platform at UC Riverside. So it is my honor this morning to introduce Dean Deborah Dees, also Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences. Dean Dees holds an MD and an MPH and is a board certified in adult psychiatry, child adolescent psychiatry, and addiction psychiatry. She is passionate about treatments for adolescent and adults with substance use disorders, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, and anxiety disorders. Dean Dees is a champion for UCR Healthy Campus. Thank you, Dean Dees, for being here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cheney, for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased this morning to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Mr. Keith Murphy is the recovery counselor at Rutgers University, and he previously served as the assistant program director of the Market Street Mission for over 14 years. Mr. Murphy earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from Rutgers and his master's of arts in counseling psychology at Nyack College. He currently holds licenses in professional counseling and clinical alcohol and drug counseling in New Jersey. He has over 18 years of experience in providing clinical care to individuals who struggle with substance use disorders and other major life issues. He's skilled in mental health counseling, group therapy, psychotherapy, counseling psychology, addiction recovery, family therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, case management, and community outreach. So you can see that he has lots of experience. In his present role as recovery counselor, Mr. Murphy works with students in the college recovery program to develop skills for recovery and life management. As a member of the Rutgers counseling staff, he has the privilege of seeing students flourish and become change agents in society. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present to you Mr. Keith Murphy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheney and Dr. Dees, for that wonderful introduction. I wonder who wrote that. But let me just honestly start off this way first. Dr. Dees, it is always awesome to see a Black woman in charge of major institutions and big parts of major institutions. So I can only imagine just what you went through to get to where you are today. So right off the bat, I just want to salute you and acknowledge the work that you've done to be where you are today. So for me to have you introduce me is a super honor and a super privilege. So keep doing what you're doing, and thank you for being a really, really a big inspiration. So I'm gonna jump in and start the presentation. Hopefully you can, you all can see my screen here. Let me start off this way and say I use he, him, and his pronouns. And why is that important? One, it's important to make the space inclusive and accessible for those who have been marginalized for a good part of their life, especially as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identification. For a long time, I did not understand, I did not do that, but now I've come to realize and see that one, having people introduce their pronouns is absolutely key. Also, I have the privilege of being the Northeast Regional Representative, for the Association of Recovery and Higher Education. That is a super honor for me. I've been in that position, volunteer position, for about 3 years now, and just having the privilege of talking to other folks who are really deeply passionate about this work is just phenomenal. And I can clearly and honestly say this: we are not in this work for the money. The real joy comes literally in seeing students change, grow, and flourish, and us being able to witness that is the absolute biggest thing here. I also want to thank my coworkers, primarily Barbara, Brian, and Lisa. Lisa Laitman specifically, as she is the director of the Alcohol and Other Drug Assistance Program at Rutgers University, and the one who spearheaded Collegiate Recovery Program at Rutgers about 32 plus years ago. Again, pioneer in the field, saw that there was a need that needed to be met, and with honestly 30 plus years ago, no internet, and really being the first ones to really start collegiate recovery and having a dorm on campus, literally just using a phone book and a phone to make calls and make it happen on a collegiate recovery on a college campus really is a big deal. And I don't think people really, if you started something new, is big, but to start something new on a college campus is even bigger, especially at the State University. So I always have to give her a shout out. The next group I really have to super acknowledge are the students at the Rutgers Recovery House, past, present, and future, because honestly, without them, there would be no me. I would not be here. I would not be in this position. It's their work that makes collegiate recovery on the Rutgers campus possible. And I really want to acknowledge all the students that are on every college campus, because without them, there really is no us. And honestly, they are the ones who are pushing this thing forward. They're the ones who honestly stand to benefit, but they're the ones who are taking the biggest risk, because one, they have to out themselves in terms of their own recovery, and then talk about and deal with the rejection and the stigma that's associated with being folks that are out about their recovery. So always hats off to them, and I'm always super proud of them. I also want to say a few other things here, and for us to take a moment and just really just a moment of silence to really acknowledge just 3 folks specifically, and I say these 3 because they are, one, the direct victims of the war on drugs. I really want to acknowledge Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. I will talk a little bit about George Floyd as we go on, but really just take a moment and recognize those lives lost as a direct result of the war on drugs. For lighter things, I live in, well, now Morris Plains, New Jersey, which is a mile down the road from where I was about a month ago. My wife and I just moved. I'm married to a great woman. I have a wonderful dog whom you will see hopefully at the end of this presentation. The last thing I'm going to say here too is that I am a person in recovery, and whatever that means. For a lot of folks, it means a lot of different things, but for me, what that means is that I have not found it necessary to use alcohol or any illicit or problematic substances to help me deal with life in about 20 years or so. So, and that couldn't have happened without the energy from the ancestors to help bring me to this point today. So I'm immediately grateful for my parents, relatives, and other folks who are in my parents' church community who saw fit to take the time to really speak to me and make sure that, one, I was given an opportunity when I didn't think I deserved an opportunity, or an opportunity was there for me. And I know so many other people did not have that. So that's me at the beginning of this talk. If we were to meet in person, I would definitely rather this be a more engaging discussion, because I am not one to believe in the pedantics that are sometimes associated with higher ed. I believe, one, that this topic and where we are in life, you don't need one person kind of lecturing folks with a PowerPoint. I think what needs to happen now is honestly is a healing circle for us really just to sit down and really get in a circle and talk face to face about what's happening and how we can make substantive and real lifelong change with regards to systemic oppression that has been just endemic in our current society. So that being said, the title of my talk here is Creating Anti-Racist and Liberated Collegiate Recovery Programs.
Keith, do
Yes,
you want to share your screen?
that would be awesome if I did that. Hold on, technology. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so
Great.
so let me go back to the previous slide. This is the talk, the creating anti-racist and liberated recovery programs. It's intentional that the background is black because I believe it is foundational for this conversation, and the lettering is mostly white because most conversations related to collegiate recovery have been centered in whiteness and white supremacy. Part of this whole discussion that I want to have is really to have us foundationally be in with the focus in on marginalized folks. This statement here is something that a friend of mine and I crafted. The collegiate recovery space cannot continue to be anti-Black, misogynistic, and homo and transphobic. Statistics show us that white cisgender individuals have greater access to reliable quality treatment and recovery support services than Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC folks. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community, those living in poverty, and other marginalized folks, and other people deal with glaring disparities as associated with the healthcare system, and that is fully intentional. And part of this work is to really, really disassemble and deconstruct and destroy that framework that has left so many people out of what has been great and accessible care. And the collegiate recovery space only mirrors what is happening in larger society, and maybe even more so because college can be a pretty elitist place. What I'm also going to ask you here is, and these are questions that I'm just going to put out there for folks, and I'm going to really talk fast because there's a lot of material and understanding where a lot of different people are coming from. And I'm really centering this talk because I'm talking to folks to understand what explicitly and implicitly happens to make collegiate recovery spaces racist and anti-liberation and oppressive for so many people. One, the first question is, what's my normal way of being when there are conversations about race and racism? Am I a quiet person? Am I a listener? Am I a debater? What purpose does my presence serve when I'm talking about race or racism or systemic oppression? How do I know when I'm doing the work in dismantling systems of oppression? How do I know when I'm sitting in privilege? Am I comfortable? Do I not speak about it? Do I address it? Do I try and make changes? What are you teaching your white students about their privilege and understanding and I really try and move away from using the word privilege, but white students understanding their advantage of being folks in collegiate recovery programs, about their role in perpetuating racism and their role in deconstructing racism? Do you help them to understand that they also are impacted and infected and affected by ongoing racism in the collegiate recovery space? How do you work to break up collusion when there's white folks who are in the space to hold and maintain the status quo? Who are you protecting? Who are you keeping safe by your silence? What are you risking by speaking out? What are you risking by not speaking out? Or who are you supporting when you do say something? So these are all basic questions that I want people here to really think about and acknowledge and understand that when they're walking into a collegiate recovery space, these are all of the things that are going on in that space. It's not simply about recovery. And I want to say this too, based on creating anti-racist or liberated collegiate recovery programs, this is not a formula. This is not a recipe. This is the beginning of a conversation, raising awareness, and then moving into action for a lot of folks. Lots of times people just want to move into action without understanding their place, their role, and what they do to perpetuate harms in the space, especially when people are literally at the most vulnerable. Part of this is, one, creating a discussion, a space for discussion. I'm going to lay out some goals, some objectives. We're going to do a quick activity, and then we're going to move into continued discussion. And again, if I were to see you in person, and we would really dialogue and build on this, because we're really going to go into some really difficult material. And what I really would like for us to do is have an ongoing conversation about this. And I would really have you work with someone, recognizing the distortions and the dynamics that are taking place in the room more often than not, most people do not have conversations about race. They are absolutely uncomfortable about doing that. But I'm assuming if you're here at this keynote, you want to have that conversation. You want to know how to do it, and you find that it's necessary. So one, in creating a braver space, not a safe space, I have some group agreements here. The first is learn to listen, or listen to learn and learn to listen. Step up, step back. Basically, if you're one to be more reserved, I would call on you to step up. If you're one to be more vocal, step back, give other people space. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. Expect that like people do have experiences that are valid. And it's important for us to have that conversation, but not one person is the expert in everything. Move up, move up. Again, if we were in person, I would ask you now metaphorically to move up into the space, to really lean into this material. Understand this, that people in their deep, and I believe racism is oppression and it's trauma. And oftentimes people, mostly white people, have the expectation for Black people and other people who've been oppressed to really articulate clearly what their pain is. And I think we need to leave space for people when they have these conversations to not articulate their points so clearly, but validate their feelings. Embrace curiosity, use this opportunity to learn. Be aware of your triggers. Not a fan of the word triggers, but I would change this to say learn what activates you. Be aware of what gets you going, what gets you disconnected in this whole thing. Be transparent, be real, take responsibility for what comes out of you, your words. These are basic things. Acknowledge the difference between intent and impact. Understand this is that you may say some things or you may hear some things or as we go on to the Q&A later on, and you may say some things that you may not mean to be a certain way and other people may respond in a certain way. Understand the impact and how that thing lands. Obviously confidentiality if you're in person, but sometimes you may hear some stuff here in this space. There's a reason why this is a closed Zoom. Please take what you've learned out of here, but not the people and not their personal stories, but take what you've learned and go with it. So maintain some air of confidentiality. Allow your humanity to show and give space and to be vulnerable and allow others to be vulnerable. Basic human stuff here. The next thing I want us to jump into is a wonderful poem from Mickey Scott B. Jones. It's about 1 minute video about brave space. So just take a minute and check it out.
Together, we will create brave space. Because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that have to fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be. But it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it. Together, we will create brave space. Because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that have to fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be. But it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side.
So I like that poem. One, it's succinct and it gets to the point of the work that we need to do. Again, there would be a deeper impact, and I think it would resonate a little bit more if we were in person and we could really build on that. But just, again, find it. There's plenty of other stuff about Brave Space. I like to thank really a lot of my colleagues for really pushing me beyond the idea of safe space, but moving into braver spaces. Okay, why create a brave space and a group agreement? Safety is key. Safety trumps all. Pardon the word, trumps. If someone is not safe, they will not trust. And I think in this world and in this climate, one, to create a space that's safe is absolutely key, especially for those who are marginalized and oppressed, because we have to understand that all oppression is held up by a system of violence. And more often than not, the person who is marginalized is the person that has to take the risk and letting you know where they're at, because they are not given the benefit of the doubt. We believe more often than not, white people are given the benefit of the doubt. Always the marginalized folks have to always prove their humanity, that they're safe, that they're not problematic, in order for a white person to feel safe. But I want you to understand this, that this talk is not centered in whiteness, it's not centered in white people, it's not centered in white supremacy. It's understanding and giving voice to those who don't have a voice. Those are the marginalized folks. And I believe that is my responsibility of using what advantages I do have in society to make sure that those who need that assistance and need that help have an opportunity for it. And that's also part of my story as to why I do what I do in relation to collegiate recovery programs and moving them to anti-racist and liberated spaces. Goals and objectives here, I'm not the expert, nor would I like to be. There are many different thoughts and theories regarding social justice. Again, it's been a long time coming and having this conversation, and I'll put it all in perspective. You know, Rutgers started in 1983. We are now in 2020, some 30 plus years later, and we are now trying to have a conversation about one, systemic oppression, racism, sexism, ableism, cisgenderism, right, and heteronormative stuff right now. That tells me that way back when, that collegiate recovery programs did not have marginalized folks in mind. So part of the reason why we need to have this discussion and keep it ongoing, one, is that marginalized folks are never centered in a lot of this work. So I hope this discussion today is also more than just a checkbox for cultural competency. I hope it's just more than a checkbox about cultural humility. It's more than just something that you could say that you could have a conversation with about what you did today on this Sunday morning, that you participated in this academic venture here, but this is actionable stuff that you can take out and really examine your life and make change, not just for you, but understanding that the work that you begin today or the work that you have been doing will move you into other spaces to recognize and pull up a marginalized person in a space and give them voice, whereas they may not feel as though they have a voice. I'm going to skip through these. I love this book. It was Dr. Crystal Fleming wrote a book on how to be less stupid about race, racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide. What I did in this thing is that I actually took some of the questions and I put them out here. And again, the slides will be available, but I want you to, and this is something that she put at the end of her book as a way to continue the discussion, which was still an amazing book. She talked about things in deconstructing race that we don't ever think about. Part of this talk and part of understanding is that we walk around in a racist structure where race is seen and experienced, but it's never really talked about. So just going through these 10 questions, what kind of contact have you had with people of different races, genders, sexual orientation, classes? Who told you about your race, your gender, and or your class? How was it explained to you? When were you first aware there was such thing as race and racial differences? How old were you? How did you first experience racism? From whom did you learn it? And again, what I love about these questions, it usually, white people don't think about these things. They just accept the world as is. But doing this will help people to understand that race is a construct and it's a way to deconstruct identity and how people have been able to flow through this world, especially the Western world, or especially America, without understanding how they got to where they are and how socialization played a huge part in it. So this is a quick activity. Take a note card or a piece of paper if you have one. On one side of that paper, I would like for you to write 3 or 4 of your social identities. It could be like student, mom, whatever, just 3 of them. And then identify which is more salient to you, which is less salient. And when you think about those, and I'll give you a quick minute, think about which identity raises some anxiety. Which identity has caused you at times to feel maybe unsafe or uncertain? Which social identities seem to generate some of the most inner conflict? Or maybe you've got none, and maybe you're just okay with all of those identities and how they intersect. But I want you to bear in mind as you think about this, and take a minute to do it, or at least 30 seconds or so. Have you ever had to lie, misdirect, fudge, omit, or remain silent about any of your identities in order to receive health care or treatment of any kind? Have you thought or experienced any of your identities as an impediment towards receiving good care? So when you think about your identities, think about those things. And I want, again, put this in perspective. Have you ever had to lie, misdirect, fudge, omit, or remain silent about any of your identities in order to receive health care or treatment of any kind? Have you thought or experienced any of your identities as an impediment towards receiving good care? And I really want you to sit in them. And if you haven't, great. But I'm guessing if you are a person in a marginalized community, that is a fact of life. You've had to change something and being painfully conscious of your identity and how you show up in certain spaces. So basically what I'm talking about here a little bit is intersectionality theory. It's just the interconnected nature of social categorizations, race, class, gender, that apply to a given individual or a group. Basically understand this, and I have another slide that talks about it, is at its most basic form, intersectional theory examines the ways that gender, race, and class and sexuality work in concert to create inequality. And what I really like from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, again, Black woman activist, pioneer, lawyer, as she worked through and understood and developed intersectionality, understand it literally as an intersection, as the collision of identities. Most of intersectionality theory is whitewashed as an interconnection of identities. How she thinks about it and how she put it down was simply this: is literally how the intersection, the collision between these identities work at times to keep people in fixed, basically she talks about the matrix of oppression or dominance, and fixed identities that don't allow them to move beyond their particular square. So that's, if you ever hear anything about intersectionality, understand it please in that way. One of the things that I want to lay the groundwork for, and I'm moving fast, is because there's a lot of ground to cover as I move through collegiate recoveries and understanding anti-racist and anti-liberation work, because all of this stuff seems to always shows up in each one of these spaces, either consciously or unconsciously, or even explicitly. Understand the 4 I's of oppression. There's ideological oppression, institutional oppression, interpersonal oppression, and internalized oppression. Ideological oppression is any oppressive system that has at its core the idea that one group is somehow better than the other. Understand, like racism, sexism, just to name a few, is that the idea is that in many ways, more intelligent, harder working, stronger, more capable, more noble, more deserving, more advanced, chosen, normal, superior, and so on folks are of a different class. The dominant group holds this idea about itself and expects the other groups to follow suit. anything that is not of the dominant group is seen as inherently inferior or less than, and I'll even go back to use the word defective. And if you are in the counseling sphere, most people come into counseling spaces feeling shame, defective, and inferior because they can't meet some goal or some aspiration that they believe that they should meet, but not understanding how a lot of their goals and things that they've put on themselves have been influenced by society at large. Interpersonal oppression is the idea that one group is better than the other and has the right to control the other. Again, understand that most of these oppressions are held together by violence. I could go on and on and on and understand, and just even looking at quickly the Black Lives Matter movement, the response to protest, right, to protest was violence. That was the response to people seeking equity in society to end extrajudicial murders and killings of Black folks. The response by the state was literal violence. That's just on the basic. And I can talk about how Black trans women are policed in ways and arrested at higher rates because based on old morality laws. Because Black trans women, if they are seen walking around in a particular community, one, they have morality laws and decency laws because most law enforcement sees Black trans women engaging in sex work, and sex work clearly is a taboo. That's a whole other thing that we could talk about, but understanding that interpersonal or how this whole system is held together by violence. And we could look at the carceral state and understand that more Black and brown folks are clearly arrested and held at longer sentences for doing and using substances at the same rate as their white counterparts. Institutional oppression, that's where most of us really are in terms of just in America. 1 out of every 4 African-American young men is currently in jail, on parole, or on probation, and that is institutionalized racism. When psychiatric institutions and associations diagnose transgender people as having a mental disorder, it is institutionalized gender oppressions and transphobia. The fact that a select few of folks can make a collection of diagnoses and make that, regardless of other folks in the room, make that the standard is problematic because, one, that's institutional oppression. And I could go on about the Supreme Court, how a few 9 elite folks who probably have never known poverty or what it meant to be a marginalized person can make decisions on the law for everybody, but not having any real experience or connection to other folks. Again, institutional oppression. And I'm going to get on, you'll see some more visual representations. Internalized oppression is one, oppressed people internalize the ideology of inferiority. When they see it reflected in institutions, we can clearly see magazines, media, other things. What is the standard of beauty? It's obviously someone who is white, male, affluent, aged between 18 to 49 as the key demographic. They are put out as what's healthy and what everyone is, or the societal norm as Audre Lorde, or the mythical norm as Audre Lorde talks about it. Internalized privilege, people who benefit the most from these systems, internalized privilege, that is how most CRPs operate and how they work, is because it's the understanding that CRPs are made and designed for white men. AA, for example, was started for and by white men.
Programs.
Yes. Okay. Understanding the 4 eyes are interlocked and interrelated. They don't work in isolation. If you're pulling on one, you're pulling on the other. They all work to keep each other functioning and flowing. I love this wonderful piece of art that was done by Jimmy Choo Choo. It's all oppression is connected. He's a Kenyan artist who just, if you look at each one of the words, it goes from environmental oppression into interpersonal oppression and to just ongoing oppression, and how all of those things are connected. You can't have one without the other. And again, I can't have the ongoing discourse about this, but there's just so much tied to just this one beautiful painting that points to how all oppression is connected and how all people suffer as a result of exploitation based on this system. CRPs in the case of the isms, one, we've got ableism, classism, racism, ageism, sexualism, cissexism, sizeism. Those are all things that are built in. I usually ask people, if I meet them in person, to really just talk about what's a missing ism, or what thing could they talk about clearly in their CRP or their collegiate recovery program. Understand that isms are the result and the name given to sociological phenomenon and the dynamics of oppression. If you look at these are portals to oppression. Looking at any one of these will take you to another as they're interlocking. Guaranteed, it is absolutely impossible for you to talk about ageism without talking about ableism, without you somehow talking about racism. I can even talk to you about the term auntie, especially in the Black community, as it relates to Black women. And usually what that does is that removes the sexuality of Black women, puts them in a particular age group, devoids them of any agency, but it's a term of endearment by some folks, but it also is a term that neuters them and makes them disempowered by calling them auntie, and also understanding the care and nature roles that some Black women have had to take in society. By calling them auntie, you are erasing who they are. Just as a quick example of how, and understanding how all the isms are connected. Next, it's easy to see the overt signs and symbols of oppression. One of the things that I honestly had to work on clearly was my idea of my own sexism and what it meant to be one as a man, as someone who identifies as a man, and how it showed up in certain spaces and not giving women any agency or power as their own people. I thought it was nice and kind of me to open the door for women, or to even, not give my wife space to talk, and understanding in other women in life to not recognize their abilities and their sense of power. And it even showed up as the person who oversees a collegiate recovery program. And I had the wonderful opportunity to have a student actually put me in check about my own sexism. And I deeply, deeply appreciated that, because one, they were kind enough to share that with me. And two, they didn't want to see the idea of the sexism perpetuated. And four, and I think this is key, they saw that the collegiate recovery program needed to be a space that was a space where people can grow and change. But I had to really understand who I was, one, as a Black man, Black cisgender, heterosexual man, and how I was showing up in these spaces. And again, I wasn't the hostile sexist, I was the benevolent sexist. That's the person I was. And I worked on, one, understanding my relationship as a man and as that relates to women on a daily basis, because I need to do that work. And understanding that, one, as a man, I take up a lot of space and I don't have the right to do that. And women are equally as capable of doing the work as I am. But that's something that I learned. That's something that my dad taught me, and other men, that women need to be protected, and this whole BS notion of chivalry and so on and so forth. This is one of my favorite things here is, this is the I'm Not Racist Hall of Fame. These people and ideas exist, are inherent, not only in our world, but even in our CRP. This is just, it is what it is, and I'm going to go into it a little bit more, but these folks are usually the ones that are easier to see and to call out. I do this as kind of a joke, but it's really absolutely true. When most people do anti-racist work, they throw in some obligatory MLK quotes and really talk about who they believe Martin Luther King was and what he wanted, and usually get this thrown back in my face. Most white people usually, when they want to talk about racism, talk about MLK, but they really don't talk about the fact that he was assassinated for talking about making systemic change. They don't ever talk about the fact that, one, he was all for desegregating schools, not in the South, but also in the North, and confronting places like Chicago and their system of segregation in Boston, and also talking about fair wages, siding with people in unions, and giving people a fair shot, and even talking about healthcare, and also being a pacifist and anti-war. So those are all the things that white people have whitewashed and seem to forget about MLK. And what was so ironic for me actually was, I actually had a white student talk to me as I was talking about race, tell me directly to my face that, well, what would Martin Luther King do? I said, honestly, he would probably want to march up and down this hall, and then he would also probably ignore you and tell you that, one, you're being a ridiculous liberal and a moderate because you love law and order more than you love justice. But obviously I couldn't tell that to a student because at that time I'm the one in charge, and the white student never would have understood it. But it's just the fact that Martin Luther King as a person was really weaponized against Black folks, especially today, for us when we stand up for ourselves. Again, anti-racist spaces, understanding that ableism played a huge part, understanding what I like to quote was with Audre Lorde, understanding what she says here: somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there's what I call a mythical norm, which each one of us within our hearts knows that is not me. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. It is with this mythical norm that trappings of power reside within society. Those of us who stand outside that power often identify one way in which we are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting other distortions around difference, some of which we ourselves may be practicing. Meaning, we get so wrapped up in the idea that we forget and we focus in on our differences, and we focus on that pain, we forget to be able to celebrate those differences, and those are the things that actually make us great. And I'll point this out really quickly. Sadly, many of you have been, I hope, watched some of the debates between those two older white men arguing about what's best for the Black community and what they've done for the Black community. To me, that is a slap in the face, that is an insult. And those are the two best people that America could come up with to help lead us further along into the 21st century. Look at that and understand that is white supremacy and white male patriarchy at its best. That is the best that America could produce. So moving along quickly, why were CRPs started? CRPs were established consciously or unconsciously to fight ableism and classism within the university structure. It was the idea that in the 1980s, a handful of universities started recognizing the need to provide support to college students in recovery from drug and alcohol use disorders as a part of their broader effort to address substance use on college campuses. Part of, let's say Rutgers, for example, part of how the program grew was that a few students, 4 students, all of them white, realized that it was not safe for them to be in their college dorm as people in recovery. They realized that they wanted to have a full-on college experience, they needed a place where they could go and talk freely, because what was the norm? The norm still is for students, especially young folks, to use and to not understand that most college campuses are recovery hostile or abstinence hostile, and they felt unsafe. But in that coalescing of that need, those 4 white students on the Rutgers campus didn't think about or even understand that there may be other folks on campus who also needed this. So as it started, much like AA, it was 4 white folks with the dominant white mythical standards already imposed or impacted on those students. There was no talk about harm reduction. There was no talk about making the tent bigger for more folks, for doing outreach, because this was something for us, by us. And for a long time, collegiate recovery programs looked like this, pretty white. Now, I know that this is the picture of the 2018 White House interns. There is 2 Black people in this picture, I believe, in the 2018 White House interns. That is a picture of oppression. 2016, Mike Pence took this selfie, and what he said and what other people said, honestly, they said 2 things. They said that this is unified and this is a group to break the status quo. I see not one Black person and a smattering of what I believe to be women in there, but that was 2016. That was the picture that they had of breaking the status quo. Now understand, if you are a marginalized person, this is what most CRPs look like on college campuses. Now imagine yourself as a person of color walking into a space like that, trying to figure out where you fit in and understanding that these people have advantages, they've had access to healthcare, the school has bent over backwards to make sure that they have services for them, right? Walk into that space. Where would you find a comfortable and safe space to go and talk about who you are as a person? You might end up looking a little bit like this, like the squad. And I love this picture of the squad, right? These 4 women of color, congresswomen, right? Their faces tell the story. That is the face of how most marginalized folks, when CRPs are presented to them, that is the face that they have. That is the feeling that they have, because they will understand what it means to be, one, erased, marginalized, and continually oppressed. And the only thing that they may have in common is their desire to make changes with their substance use, right? But everything else gets wiped out. And they're going to look at you, right? And understand, and they're going to say BS. They're going to call BS on your program. Because one, they're not going to feel invited, they're not going to feel included, and they're not going to have access to power, because most people who run CRPs are white folks. And for everything that they have in a CRP, they're going to have to fight for. So working definition of recovery, I considered both of these political statements. I'm not a fan of the first definition from SAMHSA. I like, honestly, the second definition here, voluntary mandated lifestyle change, a lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. It is absolutely key for people who are in recovery to have community, right? If I go back and this is my community, right? I'm not going to feel like I have a space. I'm going to feel like the squad. I'm always going to be marginalized. I'm going to be oppressed, and not understanding that the trauma that I've been running away from as a marginalized person will only be re-inflicted. So why do collegiate recovery programs need to be centered in anti-racist and liberation work? Because it's the idea of building community. This table here is an old, from a 2014 study that was done about collegiate recovery programs. It was an N of 486 people. Basically, just to break it down, in total, out of everyone in collegiate recovery in 2014, out of the 486 people polled, there were about 14 people who were people of color. There was still no breakdown in terms of sexual orientation or gender identification, well, basic gender identification, either people identifying as men or women, male or female. It was that black and white thing. But they thought at the time they're doing something great when they had a demographic that was broken down simply on race. So understanding how marginalized folks feel walking into most collegiate recovery space. Although this is 2014, not much has changed. Diversity, I'll skip through this because we're still moving short on time. But I will say this about social justice. Understand, and looking at this definition, it is a process and an outcome. It is not something that we get to or we arrive to in terms of establishing and creating anti-racist and liberated collegiate recovery space. It is work that needs to be done from not just the students that come in, but also from other administrators. And like I said at the very beginning, understanding the implicit or explicit bias that you have walking into that space as a person who is overseeing a program. How are you helping to collude and keep a system of oppression ongoing, and keeping a system of oppression ongoing? Understand that social justice is ongoing and active work. You will hear me quote Audre Lorde over and over because she's just the most amazing person in the world. She talked about being a marginalized woman as a Black lesbian woman. She talked about needing to do the work, right? If there's anybody that didn't, quote unquote, need to do the work, it was Audre Lorde. But she was like so committed. She said, if I have to do this work, how much more work do you need to do as a person that doesn't occupy any of these marginalized spaces. And you want to provide a service to the folks who are the most marginalized. Again, creating anti-racist and liberated collegiate recovery programs, understand the differentials here, understanding that, and Admiral Winnefeld talked about it yesterday in terms of trying to get resources and different folks, and he talked about being able to connect with other people who could provide, massive endowments in certain schools. That I will tell you, because power is segregated and aggregated at the top intentionally by white men and white folks. White speaks to white, meaning power speaks to power. If I'm a white male, I'm easier for me to talk to other white males about giving other places resources. So for us who are marginalized to talk about us needing assistance, right, it is going to be much harder. Understanding that funding is always about access to power, privilege, and priorities. Most institutions are inherently ableist and racist, heteronormative. Most institutions and programs talk about marginalized folks as defective, as a drain on institutional funding, or not part of the overall vision. Understand this, is that here we are in 2020, finally having a conversation about having Black folks or marginalized folks in collegiate recovery, not recognizing the use rates for folks that are in marginalized communities are about the same or even higher in some respects than their white counterparts, and understanding that most Black and brown folks don't get access to college. What we get access to is prison or other institutions, not recognizing that college is an option and also provides a protective factor. So the fact that Rutgers started in 1983 and so many years later, we're able to have this conversation speaks to how much racism and oppression is baked into our systems. Another infographic, but this is the most important infographic for me. For the record, George Floyd and I we're about the same age. I'm 48 this year, and I'm super grateful to be where I am and having 20 years of continuous recovery. George Floyd, when he died with that police officer's knee on his neck, and I apologize for some this may be triggering, he was someone that had gone to college, that was formerly incarcerated, and also died with the autopsy, had methamphetamine and fentanyl in his system. He is the picture of the non-traditional college student. He has been failed by every intersection of society and every major institution. He died at the hands of police from a cardiopulmonary arrest caused by restraint on his neck, so he couldn't breathe, his heart stopped essentially. The response of the state to George Floyd was not help, but was handcuffs and incarceration. Because one, he had an ongoing mental health issue, right? He was someone at one point who had tried college, had tried as a basketball player, had scholarship, and then tried a hip hop career. He went to two avenues that are celebrated in the world, in American society for Black men, is to either be a rapper or a basketball player. He could not and did not see other options available to him. And he had tried other ways to maintain and hold on to his sobriety, his recovery, and those other avenues let him down. Understand this, and if you look at the National Survey on Drug Use, and Health, the 2018 survey, most recent, 88% of Black people do not, who are dealing with mental health and substance use issues, do not seek treatment or do not seek help for their issues. Now, it doesn't necessarily go into the why, it just points out the facts. And a lot of that probably has to do with one, access to reliable and consistent healthcare, right? And then the other thing is an inherent mistrust of institutions, because all of these institutions have failed us enormously. So the question with George Floyd is, what would you do if a non-traditional student like George Floyd were to walk into your CRP and wanted to participate in your program? Do you have the resources to address his needs and understand where he's coming from and all of the trauma that he's been through as a Black man in society? So that's what I put out to everybody. So these are some other statistics. Understand these statistics that ultimately, and this is how the survey was broken down, bisexual, again, whoever's in power gets to call things certain names. So the best that the federal government could say about our LGBTQIA plus brothers and sisters and folks was that they were called sexual minority adults. If that is not the most shaming language, I don't know. But understand that their use rates are much higher. They need more support and more specific treatment related to their sexual orientation and their identity. And more often than not, they can't find those treatment areas and things that they need. So again, I imagine if our collegiate recovery folks or our collegiate recovery communities aren't equipped and ready to address folks as they change and grow, because people do not stay the same, they awaken to themselves and they bring their whole selves into these spaces, we are going to fail people. We are going to kill people. That is part of why, one, we need an anti-racist and a liberated collegiate recovery program, recognizing and understanding that folks don't stay the same. And most people that come in to collegiate recovery programs are coming in with a whole array of things that they want to address and deal with. And they want to be in a place where they can feel like they can be themselves fully, explicitly, not implicitly. And I'm moving along here really, really quickly because I'm about running out of time. I'm going to skip ahead and just to this quick statement here from Kevin Kruger. I used to love this statement because one, I was like, wow, this is a really good statement about equity and inclusion. But then I reminded myself, I'm like, wait a minute, this is something that these are essentially platitudes. This is an add-on, this is adjunctive, because he says, remind ourselves speaks to inherent privilege. Equity, inclusion are add-ons, like pickles to sandwiches in this statement. They're not baked into. Let's remind ourselves that issues, not like, let's do this first. Let's like, oh, by the way, remind me, and let's put it back in our minds that we need to do this, rather than the work is not centered on marginalized folks. And for me, that's super problematic. This is stuff that what we could do. I'm going to move through this because I really want to get to the end part here and give us some understanding here. At least with collegiate recovery programs, we have opportunities for change. We have opportunities to do something totally different. My hope and my dream, my vision for collegiate recovery programs is not about creating spaces that are just more diverse and inclusive. My dream and my hope is that we create spaces that are more accessible and actually give power, right, to the marginalized people. And by that, I mean this, is like, if programs continue to be the same and centered on whiteness, what will happen is that you'll get the same thing and expect different results. However, if you understand and center your program on marginalized folks, what happens is that you understand that everyone is taken care of, everyone benefits, and everyone gets an opportunity to grow. But more often than not, most collegiate recovery programs, as they are constructed, are really set up to, one, not include folks who have any type of disability. People have mobility issues because they do activities, this, that, and the other, not considered. They don't consider folks actively who, let's say, are Black, BIPOC folks, or members of the LGBTQIA plus community. More often than not, people are scrambling to say, well, gee, we've got these folks in our community, what do we do? Not recognizing, and I will say this with all sincerity, is that most people who are moving the needle currently in collegiate recovery programs from across the United States are the most marginalized folks. I know this because I talk to them regularly. They're the ones who are working to make sure that collegiate recovery is accessible and collegiate recovery is available for those that absolutely need it, because they understand what it means to be first. They understand what it means to, one, to benefit from having an actual community. They understand what it means to be an activist in this space, and they deeply link their survival to the survival of the CRP. Most of the people that I've worked with in the past who are cisgendered white folks use the space and walk away from the space not thinking that they need to do anything for other folks coming up behind them. They use it and walk away and they dispose of it. But the people who see the value in the collegiate recovery space are the most marginalized, because it's in that space that universities become smaller, they build greater communities, and they understand that, one, they have the most opportunity to shape and impact how people see and understand, and I say stigma, but stigma is not a big enough word, but they see the life and death implications of not having a fully vibrant collegiate recovery community. Equality and equity, we've seen this over and over again. This is the work of those who are in charge of CRPs, is to make the space equitable, not equal. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful. Equality is treating everyone the same. That is ridiculous because, one, first recognize we don't treat everybody the same. The other part of it is not everybody needs the same thing, is understanding where everyone is at. And just for background, and I know this is some back and forth about this picture. The original artist put this together to start a conversation. He knew that this was not going to be the end of any conversation. Some pictures have equality and equity where the fence is removed and the people who are using the crates can actually see the whole game without any impediments. And that has to do with capitalism and unfair distribution of wealth and goods. But that's a whole other part of a conversation that we could have. And I just want to jump into this last piece before I wrap up here, is this: consider these things here. When developing or going back towards your CRP, consider what's non-equitable versus equitable. Equitable is marginalized folks in positions of power, increased access to specialized treatment for specialized communities, understanding that as people come into your CRPs, they may not leave the same way, they may be exposed to different things. Understand and see oppression as trauma and treat it as such. Develop a language, a skill, and acumen to understand and see that when you're working with folks from marginalized communities, that what they're talking about in terms of oppression is trauma related. And there are no safe spaces for them to talk about this. And the goal of the CRP is not to inflict more pain, but to be a healing space. Understand too, have practice-based evidence models of treatment, not evidence-based practice, meaning this, more often than not, most evidence-based practice is based on work that has been done, not with marginalized folks, but with other folks in the community. Listen to folks from the community to see what has worked for them. Understand and expand ideas and ways of healing that are beyond the Western frame. Move beyond what adventure therapy and group work. Understand, have maybe healing circles. Talk about music, talk about art, not just Western art, not just about watercolor painting, but what types of things, what other creative things. Writing, I'll tell you this quick story, and this is a shame of mine. There's someone that I was working with a long time ago. He used to write raps, and he used to write them down, and I'd be like, that's not gonna help you. Like, you need to figure out a way to deal with life and so on. But I missed that was part of his therapy. That was part of the work he needed to do. I was in such a rigid frame based on the Western training that I had that I thought that that's what recovery looked like, and it could only be this way. And what that person was able to teach me is that healing looks different for different folks. It was my job and my responsibility, one, to meet him where he was at and understand the power of spoken word for him. So I had to get outside of my frame. Again, these are equitable, non-equitable considerations. They're not absolutes by any stretch of the imagination. Please put these in your lexicon and understand this. I'm also going to offer you some quick questions and then just wrap up here is, what prompts you to do anti-racist work? How do you know when you're in the work? Where have you missed opportunities to do the work? How have you discussed issues related to racial equity and inclusion in the past and now? What equitable strategies have you intentionally implemented in your CRPs? How would I know as a marginalized person that this is an okay place for me to go? What are you teaching your white students about their privilege? Who is being kept safe by your silence? Again, when did you become aware of white supremacy? Or are you even aware of white supremacy in your CRP? Are you aware of how it shows up and what other heteronormative stuff, what other marginalized, and dare I say, tools are in your CRP that are not allowing marginalized folks to feel a part of or included? Here's some quick resources. Again, it's not complete, it's not total. Because of where we are today and with COVID and the push for an ending of systemic oppression, the world is opened up to a lot of different folks to have a lot of different conversations. One of the things I don't say to people anymore is do not just go out there and try and Google resources, because you're going to get a lot of weird folks. Talk to people that you trust, and then try and build from there, and understand and expand your understanding of what it means to work with marginalized folks, and understand the part that you play in order to dismantle or to keep the system in place. And that is me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Again, I regret not being able to be there in person. I really would love for this to be an ongoing and spirited discussion, because I really would just love to empower folks and move them beyond a place of comfort into a place of change. And that is the picture of my lovely dog, whom I love a lot. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was really amazing. Just thank you for being here with us. Thank to all the audience members for being here. I love your dog. So we have a few questions, and I'm just going to go ahead and read them, and if you would be willing to respond, Keith. So the first question is from Ryan Harden. Can you talk a little more about why abstinence-focused recovery is non-equitable? I agree and support and would love to hear more about it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make sure I hear the question. Why non-abstinence? Say the question again. I want to hear it.
Why abstinence-focused recovery is non-equitable.
Oh yeah, I mean, because one, recovery looks different for different folks, and you're not looking how people change. And again, that is part of the that's part of this wild puritanical standard that people have put up about abstinence-based recovery being the gold standard of recovery, not recognizing that most people resolve their addiction issues and can use other substances without problem. But the way treatment has developed over time as an industry, because that's one of the things I didn't talk about, was how healthcare is an industry and a commodity, is that it pushes people towards an abstinence model of recovery. And not all people want, need, or really benefit from abstinence-based recovery. I didn't even go into the idea of medication-assisted recovery, which I hate is ridiculous as a term, or medication-assisted treatment, which is a ridiculous term, because one, it still imposes stigma. Why don't we just call it recovery and treatment? Because if I have anxiety issues, the thing that I'm really dealing with, if I get a script for, I'm just saying Valium or benzodiazepines or sedative, no one is going to say, hey, are you on medication-assisted treatment? They're like, no, I'm just getting Valium to help me deal with my anxiety, just as an example, or Ativan. No, there's no other label to it. But there's something about where people in recovery from substances are demonized, literally demonized, in terms of getting help. So hopefully I answered that question.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question. This is from Tyrone Carter. Thoughts regarding students in recovery experiencing racism, such as microaggressions, implicit bias, victim of stereotypes, fetishism, and shutdowns when sharing about racialization during recovery meetings and beyond. Moreover, being told that acceptance is the key to their sobriety and racism is an outside issue. So the question is this an example of white fragility behaving at its best? Any tools to navigate this phenomenon?
Yeah, white fragility is too soft of a term because what it is whiteness weaponized, not allowing and understanding people to and weaponize. Literally, what it means is that it literally in this context is that it harms, it hurts, and it continues to keep the status quo in check. And people do use it to say, well, we're in this 12-step fellowship. That's an outside issue, not recognizing that one, and Purdue had a paper in 2012 talking about how Black men have used alcohol as a way to deal with literal institutional unkindness and racism. So we know that part of the reason why people use, and honestly, part of my story is I used because I did not know how to cope and deal with the world as it was. There was something defective about me. If I don't have a space to talk about who I am as a whole person, how am I going to resolve my addiction issues? So I encourage folks, and this is hard because how people grow as community, and stigma is murder. It's harder for marginalized folks to find a community, and it's even harder for marginalized folks to find folks who are finding abstinence-based recovery. Because most activists, for good or for ill, don't have problems with substances, so freely use substances. So it's still a tough space for them to be in. So their group gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Long answer to a very short question.
Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll end. And I know Abhi has at 11:15 going to start his wellness break. So if anyone would like to join Abhi on his wellness break, feel free to exit here. If it's okay, Keith, 2 more questions. Does that work?
Oh yeah, sure.
So this question is from Stephen Sussman. Is this an example of being exclusionary? We don't spend 10 minutes with people who don't want what we have.
Yeah, for sure. That's not the idea of meeting people where they're at. And, what is it that you have? That's the whole 12-step thing. Like, hey, you want what we've got, and there's only one way for someone to resolve their addiction issues. And not recognizing that only 2% of people that are in recovery actually attend 12-step meetings, but still somehow that 12-step stuff has become part of the lexicon. And to me, it's become a cop-out, and it's actually pretty lazy. And that's one of the perils of white supremacy, is that it's not imaginative. In fact, it keeps the status quo, and it doesn't allow people to come up with new ideas and do different things. So that's why we have 2 70-year-old white men talking about the future as president, because white male patriarchy is just not really imaginative. It's pretty old hat.
I feel like there's so much we can talk about. So this last question, I am a white passing multiracial person of color. I acknowledge this privilege constantly. What is the most effective way to be an ally and create a space for underrepresented voices to be heard?
That's a big question. Okay, I'm a little bit more controversial in terms of the term ally. I hate it, not a fan. Because where do you get to be an ally, and who determines your allyship? And part of that is understanding how your privilege shows up. Maybe meet you in person, find other folks in an affinity group, and understand your role and show up how you can be a support. There's a lot to that to unpack. So right now, and to be fair, I almost cursed. Go to places where they're doing harm reduction, hand out sandwiches, do that. Give to places where people need bail relief, donate to that for right now. If you're on social media, learn how to post, read a book for right now. I don't know what it is you're doing, and I'm not trying to throw you under the bus, but that's such a big, broad question. But the first thing honestly for me is drop the term ally and I just not a super fan.
Okay, thank you so much, Keith. It was really amazing and inspiring, and I think probably many of us on this call would like to just continue chatting. There are a number of comments about the impact of this presentation that you just gave, so feel free to take a look in the chat of all the accolades. And I just also want to let people know that we have a talk at 11:30 where we will be talking about these kinds of issues. So we'll specifically be talking about what we've learned over the past year and a half in this PCORI project, our Voice and Collegiate Recovery project. And in collaboration with students, we collected and analyzed data. And the themes that have consistently come up is institutional resources or lack thereof, which speaks to this idea of systemic oppression and of white supremacy, as well as diversity and stigma. So please join us. We would love for all of you to help us shape our next step for collegiate recovery research.